Hello, welcome to this episode of 5 in 5, where we go over 5 studies in 5 minutes or more. I haven't done one of these in a while. So, critical race theory, or CRT for short, is apparently the biggest issue that anyone could possibly be talking about now that the pandemic is completely over, civil rights have been achieved for everyone forever, income inequality has been addressed, and climate change just doesn't exist anymore. Isn't that great news to hear? CRT is so important, in fact, that at least 5 Republican-led state legislatures have passed bans on critical race theory or related topics in recent months, with roughly 9 other states pressing for similar measures. You know, because free speech is the foundation of our society. Critical race theory is a loosely organized intellectual movement composed of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. For the purposes of this video, it can be grossly oversimplified into 4 tenets. 1. Race isn't biologically real, but socially constructed. 2. Racism is normal in modern society due to its embedding in institutions. 3. Racism is not merely confined to a few bad apples or individual instances, but rather is systemic in nature. And 4. The lived experiences of people of color are to be recognized alongside hard data and statistics. So why do modern thought leaders like Ben Shapiro, ex-President Donald Trump, and conceptual Jimmy Swordman oppose such seemingly straightforward and agreeable principles with the fervor of 1,000 suns? Well, for an in-depth look at number 3... You just wait. But until then, for a general understanding, here are 5 studies that hopefully shed some light on why certain people don't want critical race theory being talked about anywhere for any reason ever. As always, the studies are linked down below in the description. Our first study addresses the elephant in the room, that opposition to CRT and support for Trump overlap basically 1-to-1. In The Threat of Increasing Diversity, Why Many White Americans Support Trump in the 2016 Presidential Election, published in Group Processes Intergroup Relations in 2018, the authors designed an experiment to find out how salient white identity and an awareness of changing racial demographics in America contributed to Trump's success. They surveyed 376 white Americans who identified as either Democrat or Republican, who were randomly assigned to read one of 2 press releases before being assessed on measures such as opposition to political correctness and support for anti-immigrant policies. One press release indicated that racial minorities will outnumber non-Hispanic whites in the U.S. by 2042, the racial shift condition, and the other used similar language to indicate that geographic mobility is increasing, which was the control condition. Among whites high in ethnic identification, the racial shift message indirectly predicted increased support for Trump and anti-immigrant policies and increased opposition to political correctness norms, while the same was not true for whites low in ethnic identification, who actually saw a decrease in support for Trump and his policies when exposed to the racial shift condition. Basically, white people who care about their racial identity really want to see America stay white and saw Trump and his policies as a pretty good way to achieve that. This could be simple in-group preference. Who wants to see their group lose power? Well, according to our next study, that depends on whether or not you see your group's status as legitimate. According to a 2018 study published in Frontiers in Psychology titled Majority Group Members' Negative Reactions to Future Demographic Shifts Depend on the Perceived Legitimacy of Their Status, Findings from the United States and Portugal. Okay, well, the title kind of says it. Yeah, sometimes the title is a sentence that okay. So basically, white people who see their group status as highly legitimate, which is to say white people who think they've earned their place on top, exhibited way more negative emotions, anger and fear, towards minorities after exposure to projections of a decline in the relative size of the white American population. The same was true in Portugal, highlighting that this phenomenon may be true across cultures. Our next 2 studies pair well together with that background. The first one, published in 2014 in Psychological Science, titled On the Precipice of a Majority-Minority America, Perceived Status Threat from the Racial Demographic Shift Affects White Americans' Political Ideology, is similar to our first study in both its design and its findings. The difference here is that the participants were self-identified as politically unaffiliated instead of Democrat or Republican. Upon exposure to the racial shift condition, they were far more likely to endorse conservative policies than those exposed to the control condition, indicating that maybe white Americans aren't as colorblind as they like to claim. This could be due to the notion that whites see racism as a zero-sum game that they are now losing, which is the title of the other study here and was published in 2011 in Perspectives on Psychological Science. Here, white people associated a decrease in perceived bias against black people with an increase in perceived bias against whites, a relationship not shared by black people who did view anti-black bias as decreasing, but not at the expense of an increase in anti-white bias. This was so severe for the white people in this study that as far back as the 2000s, white people thought that anti-white bias was worse than anti-black bias. This brings to mind the adage, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression, which you can now say is backed up by data. Lastly, I think it's fair to say that opposition to CRT is not merely disagreeing with the concepts or advocating for different solutions to an agreed upon problem. Critics like Christopher Rufo and James Lindsay want the theory to be synonymous with evil, with dishonest hucksters who only want to destroy. Unfortunately, while this shows a hilarious lack of self-awareness that will be exposed soon enough, Mr. Lindsay, it's way easier to get people to ascribe malicious intent to an ideology or policy that challenges the status quo, like CRT, versus one that conserves it, like conservatism. In Perceiving Self-Interest, Power, Ideology, and Maintenance of the Status Quo, published in Social Justice Research in 2005, the researchers conducted a series of experiments that showed people attribute more selfish motivations behind arguments when they come from a small rather than a large group, a low status rather than a high status group, and when it's trying to benefit an out group rather than an in group. In conclusion, even though none of these studies actually directly talked about critical race theory, I think they give a pretty good overview of the modern opposition to it, which also has nothing to do whatsoever with critical race theory. Despite being around for decades, no one in the mainstream knew or talked about it until it became the new conservative obsession somewhere around the summer of 2020, when, for unknown reasons, it suddenly became very important to make right-wing white people very concerned about anti-white racism. Now, it would be really reductive to say that everyone who's currently really opposed to CRT is just rebranding the white genocide conspiracy theory and trying to push it on other people. But it would also be correct, by